The rooster crowed at 2:30 in the morning, and Ada Sutter was reaching for her boots before the sound finished rolling across the yard. She didn't know why. Roosters crowed at dawn. That was their single job in a world that had little patience for anything else a rooster might do. But Drum had never cared what roosters were supposed to do, and on this night, the first cold night of October, 1872, he threw his head back and sent his voice through the dark like a fist on a door. Thomas heard it too. He was beside her in the bed they had shared for 11 years, and he was sitting up before she could form the words to ask him what was wrong. That was the kind of man he was. He heard things before they arrived. He felt the shift in a room the way a farmer feels the shift in weather, not with instruments, but with something older that lived in the bones. "What is it?" Ada said. He didn't answer. He was pulling on his boots, reaching for the Winchester. Their cabin sat a quarter-mile west of Merrow, a town of 23 buildings along the supply road running south from Fort Davis into the Davis Mountains. Limpia Creek wound behind their property. The mountains stood to the south like a wall someone had built and walked away from. "Stay inside," Thomas said. Those were the last words he ever spoke to her. She heard the horses first. 6, maybe 8, coming fast from the south. Then the shooting started in town, a ragged burst that broke the night open like a dropped plate. Thomas was already out the door, already running toward the sound, because that was who he was. He ran toward things that other people ran from. Ada stood in the doorway and watched the town burn. She saw the general store's windows glow orange, then shatter. She saw the livery doors kicked open and horses driven out. She saw shadows on horseback moving through the firelight with the unhurried confidence of men who had done this before and expected to do it again. And she saw Thomas. He had reached the edge of town. He was firing from behind the blacksmith's forge, and his shooting was good. Good enough to turn 2 riders away from the schoolhouse where the teacher and her 2 children hid. Good enough to give the town 30 seconds it would not have otherwise had. Then the firelight found him, and someone on a dark horse fired back. The raiders left before dawn. They took what they wanted, supplies, ammunition, 3 horses, and rode south toward the mountains. They left 2 buildings burning and 1 man dead behind the blacksmith's forge. Ada found Thomas at first light. She knelt in the dirt beside him and did not make a sound, because sound was not what he needed from her. What he needed was for her to be the woman he had married, and that woman did not break where people could see her. She broke later. She broke at home, with the door closed and her face pressed into the quilt that still smelled like him, and Drum, that odd, contrary rooster, stood on the porch railing outside the window and did not crow. He was quiet for the first time in his life, as if he understood. Settle in wherever you are tonight. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from. We like knowing who's sitting with us in the dark. The town buried Thomas Sutter on a clear morning with the mountains watching and Limpia Creek running low behind the cemetery. 40 people stood around the grave. The preacher said the words. Ada stood at the front and held herself the way a fence post holds a fence, straight, rooted, still. Afterward, people told her things. She was strong, they said. Thomas was a hero. She should come stay with family, or move to Fort Davis where it was safe, or sell the property and start over somewhere that wasn't on a supply road that outlaws used like a private highway. They told her, with varying gentleness, that a woman alone could not keep a homestead in the Davis Mountains. Ada listened to all of it. She thanked them for their kindness. She went home and fed Drum and sat on the porch and watched the sun go down behind the mountains and did not leave. The second raid came in February of 1873, for months after the first. Ada was asleep when Drum started. Not his dawn crow, not his idle afternoon muttering, but the sharp, stuttering alarm he had made the night Thomas died. She was out of bed and had a lamp lit and was pulling on her coat before she understood what she was doing. Her hands knew before her mind did. She rang the bell, an old stove kettle she had hung from the porch rafter with a length of wire. She rang it and rang it and rang it, and the sound carried across the quarter-mile to town the way sound carries on cold desert air, thin and far and sharp as a splinter. The town had 9 minutes of warning. 9 minutes was enough to douse lamps, lock doors, load rifles, and get children under beds. The raiders came expecting sleeping buildings and found dark ones. They took what they could grab from the general store and left fast, and nobody died. 9 people in town said it was luck. 6 said it was God. Ada said nothing. She sat on her porch with Drum on her knee and thought about the distance a horse travels in 9 minutes. And she began to understand what Drum was hearing that no one else could. Horses move the ground. Even a dozen horses, even at a walk, even 3 miles out. The desert floor carried that vibration quietly, and something in Drum's small architecture could feel it. He could feel it the way she could feel a storm coming in the stiffness of her wrists. He was not prophetic. He was not blessed. He was a rooster with ears that worked better than theirs, and that was all, and that was enough. By the third raid, June of 1873, a hot night with the crickets screaming, the town was listening. Not everyone. Not the skeptic from the assay office who said a bird couldn't predict a raid any more than a cat could predict rain. But most of them. When Drum crowed, Ada rang the kettle, and people moved. They had a system now, crude and imperfect, but it had saved lives twice, and that was more than the territory's law had done. The raids kept coming. Twice a year, sometimes 3 times. The raiders were led by a man named Levi Grund, though Ada would not learn his name until the 4th year. He had 16 men and used the Davis Mountains the way a coyote uses brush, slipping in, striking, vanishing south where the peaks folded into country a posse couldn't follow. Fort Davis was a day's ride north. By the time the military responded, Grund was gone and the trail was cold. The years folded. 1874, 1875, 1876. Each raid was different, and each time, Drum warned them. Sometimes 20 minutes ahead. Sometimes less. Once, only 7 minutes. And that was the night the schoolhouse burned and the teacher, Mrs. Calloway, stood in the road with a shotgun and drove 3 men off her porch while the children climbed out the back window. Ada was not idle between raids. She kept a record, not a diary, a map. On the back of a shipping crate nailed to the kitchen wall, she charted every raid. The month, the hour, the direction of approach, the number of riders, what they took. She tracked the phases of the moon, because Grund preferred dark nights. She tracked the supply schedule, because he preferred to raid when the road had just delivered goods. She tracked the seasons, because he never came in deep winter when the passes were frozen. She did not tell anyone about the map. Not yet. Ezra Hadley noticed. He ran the livery stable, the same stable hit in the first raid, rebuilt twice since. He was about 45 with a scar across his left palm from a horse that had kicked him in 69, and a quietness most people mistook for shyness. It was not shyness. It was the careful stillness of a man who had lost his wife and infant daughter to a fever in 68 and had spent the years since learning that silence was the only thing that didn't ask him questions. He had watched Ada since the funeral, not with longing, with respect. He recognized something in her that he recognized in himself. The refusal to leave a place that had taken everything from you, because leaving would mean the loss was in charge, and neither of them would allow that. He began leaving things at her gate. Scratch feed for Drum. A new hinge when the old one rusted. Firewood split so fine it looked like it had been done with a razor. He never knocked. He never waited to be thanked. She would step outside in the morning and find the evidence of his care arranged with quiet precision, and she would look toward the livery half a mile east and know he was already inside it, working, not needing her to see. The first time they spoke more than 10 words to each other was in the autumn of 1877, the 5th year after the 9th raid. Ada was sitting on her porch studying the map on the shipping crate when Ezra walked up the road with a bucket of apple slices. For Drum, he said, though Drum had never eaten apple slices, and they both knew it. He stood at the fence for a long time looking at the map. She let him look. She had nothing to hide. She was tired of hiding it. You've been tracking him, Ezra said. Not a question. 5 years' worth, Ada said. Ezra studied the map the way he studied a horse's gait, with the patience of a man who understood that patterns revealed themselves only to people willing to sit with them. He traced the approach routes. He tapped the dates. He noted the gaps, the months when Grund didn't come, and why. You know when he's coming next, Ezra said. I know when he's most likely to come, Ada said. That's not the same as knowing. Close enough for me, Ezra said. He came back the next day with lumber and a plan. He reinforced the shutters on every building that would let him, and on the ones that wouldn't, he did it anyway and let them complain. He built a signal tower, a platform on the livery roof where a lantern could be seen from Fort Davis on a clear night. He taught 3 ranch hands to fire a distress pattern, 3 shots, pause, 3 shots. that the cavalry would recognize. Ada taught the women. She taught them to keep flour sacks packed with documents and money and medicine ready to grab and run. She taught them which walls were thick enough to stop a pistol ball. She taught them to listen, not for drum, but for the kettle, and what it meant, and what to do when it rang. Most folks thought the bird was just noise. Ada thought noise was just a word people used for sounds they hadn't learned to listen to yet. By 1880, the 8th year, Merrow was a different town. Not richer, not bigger, but tougher, tighter. The buildings that had burned had been rebuilt with stone foundations and iron shutters. The supply road had a mounted patrol, 2 men, rotating shifts, that Ezra organized and the town funded. The raids still came, but they cost Grund more each time. He lost a man in 79. He lost 2 in 80. He was a businessman, and the business was getting expensive. What would you have done? 10 years of a bird telling you danger was coming, and a woman who listened every single time. Would you have stayed? Would you have built what she built? Or would you have walked away and let the dark have the town? In the spring of 1882, the 10th year, Grund made a decision. The raids were no longer profitable. The town fought back too hard, recovered too fast, lost too little. He could move on. That was the smart play. But Grund had been outsmarted by a widow and a rooster for 10 years, and the knowledge had curdled inside him until the raids were no longer about profit. They were about pride. He wanted Merrow erased. Not raided. Erased. He wanted the buildings ash and that woman. That plain, stubborn, impossible woman. He wanted her to watch it happen and understand she had been wrong to stay. He brought every man he had. 22 riders. He brought kerosene and dynamite and the kind of anger that makes a man stupid in the specific ways that get men killed. Drum was old now. 10 years old, which was ancient for a rooster. His comb had gone pale, and his crow had lost the bright edge it once carried. He moved slower. He ate less. Ada had begun to wonder what would happen when Drum was gone, whether anyone would hear what he heard, whether everything she had built was resting on the ears of a single aging bird. On the night of October 3rd, 1882, Drum crowed. It was not his old crow. It was thinner, rougher, cracked at the edges. But it was the crow, the alarm, the sound that had saved this town 23 times over 10 years. Ada was out of bed. She rang the kettle. And then she did something she had never done before. She walked to the livery, where Ezra was already standing on the signal platform with the lantern lit, and she said, "This is the big one. I need you to trust me." Ezra looked at her. He had been trusting her for 5 years without being asked. He lit the signal lantern and raised it toward Fort Davis. He fired the distress pattern, 3 shots, pause, 3 shots, into the cold sky. Then he climbed down and stood beside her. "What's the plan?" he said. "The map," Ada said. "He always comes from the south. The southern approach is narrow. The canyon funnels them between the ridge and the creek. If we block the exit with the supply wagons and put shooters on the ridge, he's in a box." Ezra stared at her. He could see the understanding move across his face like dawn across a field, slowly, then all at once. "You've been planning this for years," he said. "I've been planning this since the night Thomas died," Ada said. The town moved. They had drilled for this, not with the understanding that this night was the night, but with the decade of practice that had made the drilling feel like something else. The ranch hands rolled the supply wagons across the southern road. The women took the children to the stone cellar beneath the church. The men with rifles climbed the ridge above the canyon and lay flat in the scrub and the cold and waited. Grund came at midnight. 22 riders, moving fast, confident, expecting dark buildings and sleeping people in a town that had gotten lucky one too many times and was finally due for the night its luck ran out. What he found was a canyon with one way in and no way out. The shooting lasted 4 minutes. It was not a battle. It was a door slamming shut. Grund's men fired into the dark and hit nothing. The men on the ridge fired down into a narrow channel of horseflesh and torchlight and hit everything. 5 of Grund's men died in the canyon. 9 threw down their weapons. 6 rode back and found the wagons blocking the exit and surrendered to a blacksmith with a Sharps rifle who had never shot at a man before and whose hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold it. But who held it anyway? Because Ada Sutter had taught him what to do when the kettle rang. Grund himself made it through. He was a better rider than his men, and he broke through the scrub on the western edge of the canyon and rode hard toward the one building he knew. The cabin a quarter-mile west of town, the one that belonged to the widow. He found her standing on the porch. She was holding Thomas's Winchester. She had not fired it in 10 years. She had cleaned it every month, oiled the action, kept the cartridges fresh, but she had never pulled the trigger, because pulling the trigger meant the world had finally come to her door, and she was the only one left to answer it. Grund rode into the yard with his pistol drawn and his face twisted with the rage of a man who had been beaten by a rooster. He saw the woman on the porch, small, plain, alone, 53 years old, standing in a nightgown and boots with a rifle she didn't look strong enough to hold. And he laughed. "You," he said. "This whole time, it was you." "Yes," Ada said. She raised the Winchester, and she did not fire. She held it the way Thomas had held it the night he died. Steady, certain, aimed at the center of the man who had taken everything from her. "You're going to drop that pistol," she said. "You're going to climb down from that horse. And you're going to walk to town and wait for the cavalry from Fort Davis, who will be here by morning. Or you're going to sit on that horse and try to shoot me, and before your bullet reaches me, mine will reach you, and we will both find out which one of us was more tired of being afraid." Grund looked at her. He looked at the rifle. He looked at the dark behind her where the sound of the town's men was getting closer, and he understood that he was not looking at a frightened woman. He was looking at 10 years of patience aimed at his chest. He dropped the pistol. "If this story has found you tonight, you are exactly who we wrote it for. A like and a subscribe tells us to keep going. We'll keep going." They took Grund to Fort Davis in the morning. The cavalry arrived at dawn, a detachment of the 9th Cavalry, the Buffalo soldiers who had ridden through the night at the signal fire's call. They found prisoners in the canyon, dead in the wash, and a man named Levi Grund sitting in the Marrow jail with his wrists in irons and a look on his face like a man who had finally encountered something he could not ride away from. Grund was tried at Fort Davis in December and sentenced to 20 years in the Territorial Penitentiary. His gang was broken. The survivors scattered across jails from El Paso to Yuma. The supplies they had stolen were never recovered, but it didn't matter. The road was safe. The raids were over. The town held a gathering the night after the cavalry left. Not a celebration. These were not people who celebrated easily. A gathering. They built a bonfire in the middle of the supply road, and someone brought a fiddle, and someone brought whiskey, and someone brought a chair for Ada because her knees had started to shake. Ezra sat beside her. He had taken a bullet through the meat of his left arm in the canyon fight, and someone had bandaged it with a strip of flour sack, and he held the bandaged arm against his chest the way a man holds something he is not sure he deserves to keep. The town came to her, one by one, and said the things they had not said in 10 years. The blacksmith said he was sorry he'd called the rooster a nuisance. Mrs. Calloway said she would have lost her children without the kettle. The assay office skeptic stood in front of Ada with his hat in his hands and nothing in his mouth at all, and Ada reached up and touched his arm and said, "It's all right. You weren't ready to hear it yet." After the fire burned low and the stars came out thick and white over the Davis Mountains, Ezra and Ada sat on her porch. Drum was roosting in the box Ezra had built for him, padded with straw, better than most people in Marrow slept in. The rooster was asleep. His breathing was slow, and his comb caught the last light of the fire like a small, faded flag. "I need to tell you something," Ezra said. "You don't have to," Ada said. "I want to. I've been carrying it too long." She waited. She was good at waiting. 10 years had made her an expert. "The night my wife died," Ezra said, "I was in the barn. She was in the house. She called for me, and I didn't hear her. She walked to the barn door and couldn't make it back inside. She sat down on the step, and that's where I found her, in the morning, with the baby still in her arms." He paused. "I have spent 14 years believing that if I had been a man who listened better, they would be alive." Ada didn't speak. She let the silence hold the weight of what he had said, because she knew that silence was sometimes the only honest response to a grief too large for words. "Then I met your rooster," Ezra said, and something that was almost a smile moved across his face and then disappeared. "And I met you. And I watched you listen to that bird for 10 years. Every night. Without fail. Without anyone thanking you. Without anyone believing you. And I thought, there is a woman who listens. There is a woman who will not let the world take someone because she didn't hear the call." He turned to her. His eyes were wet and his voice was steady, and the firelight made the bandage on his arm glow like a white flag. "He crowed for 10 years, and you answered him every time," Ezra said. I've been trying to figure out which one of you was braver. Ada reached over and took his hand, the uninjured one, and held it the way you hold something you have been reaching for across a long, dark room and have finally found. Her fingers were rough and his were rough, and neither let go. I think, Ada said. We were both just tired of being afraid alone. They sat like that until the fire was ash and the mountains turned from black to blue against the first thin line of dawn. Drum stirred in his box. He lifted his pale comb and ruffled his feathers and opened his eyes and looked at the sky the way he had looked at it every morning for 10 years, with the certainty of a creature who knew his job and did not intend to stop. And he crowed. Not the alarm. Not the sharp, stuttering warning that had saved 23 raids and uncounted lives. His morning crow. The one he had been born knowing. The one that said the sun was up and the world was still here and there was work to do. The town of Merrow heard it. Every person in every bed and every blanket on every floor heard that old, cracked, perfect crow roll across the cold October morning, and they knew what it meant. Not danger. Not warning. Morning. Just morning. The first safe morning in 10 years. Ezra squeezed her hand. Ada closed her eyes. The sun came over the ridge and touched the porch and touched the rooster and touched the woman and the man who had finally stopped waiting and started reaching, and the mountains held them the way they had always held this town. Quietly, without judgment, solid and permanent, and older than any grief that tried to live in their shadow. 3 years later, Ezra and Ada were married on the porch where they had sat that night. The whole town came. Mrs. Calloway's children, the ones who had climbed out the schoolhouse window in '73, stood up with them. The blacksmith built an iron rooster weather vane for the cabin roof, and it turned in the wind and looked, from a distance, like it was crowing. Drum did not live to see the wedding. He died the previous winter, quiet and still, in his box beside the door. Ada buried him under the pinyon tree behind the cabin and planted wildflowers on the grave, and Ezra built a small marker that read, Drum. He listened when no one else would. They got another rooster. A young one, red-feathered and loud. Ada named him Thomas. Ezra said that seemed like a lot to put on a bird. Ada said the bird could handle it. Every morning for the rest of her life, Ada Sutter heard a rooster crow at dawn and knew what it meant. It meant the world was still here. It meant the night had ended. It meant that the thing you have given up on tends to find you, not in the form you expected, not on the schedule you planned, but in the voice of a small, contrary creature who refused to stop calling until someone brave enough listened. And the mountains stood, and the creek ran, and the rooster crowed at the morning, not because something was coming, but because something had finally arrived. Next, we'll tell you the story of a woman who was sent away from her family in 1884 because she'd stopped speaking after her son died, and the horse trainer in Montana who never asked her to say a word, and who built her a world where silence was not a wound but a language, and where the first thing she said out loud, after 2 years of nothing, was his name.